In the 5+ years of this podcast, I'd say that we have spent a lot of time on various hot button issues. I mean, we live here quite squarely in the ones that surround race and identity, wouldn't you say? But, one of the facets of identity that we don't often explore on the podcast is that of religion. Not because we don't want to talk about it, but a lot of times that opportunity doesn't really present itself.
And I think that's why we're so excited to talk today to one of the authors of Healing Our Way Home, which is a new book that addresses white supremacy and identity through the lens of Black Buddhist teachings. What started out as a series of conversations between three practitioners really morphed into the whole book, which focuses on self-care and Buddhist teachings with the goal of collective liberation in mind, but in a way that's totally different than what we've seen out there so far. Can't wait for you all to listen and learn more. Welcome to the Dear White Women podcast, the show that helps white women use their privilege to uproot systemic racism without centering themselves in the process. We are your multi-ethnic, Japanese, and white hosts, Sarah and Misasha.
All right, we are so excited to have you on our podcast. Could you please introduce yourself for our listeners?
Sure. I'm really excited to be here with you both. I'm Kyra Jewel Lingo. I live in Long Island. I'm a Dharma teacher. You're from Long Island.
I'm from Long Island. I haven't met people from Long Island. Port Washington.
Port Washington. Okay, I know Port Washington.
That's funny.
Yeah. So I live in Garden City. I don't know.
Oh, yeah. We played Garden City in field hockey in high school. My mother is still in the same house that I was born and raised in, which is unusual nowadays. So
lovely. Yeah. So that's where I live now. I'm a meditation and Dharma teacher. I was a nun for 15 years in the community of Thich Nhat Hanh and have also become a Dharma teacher, not only in that tradition, but also in the Vipassana Buddhist lineage. I'm biracial, Black and white, and also identify as Black. Grew up internationally in a family religious order, a Christian community that was doing engaged Christianity, kind of human development projects all over the world. Yeah, did a bachelor's and master's in anthropology and social sciences, and then found my way to the Plum Village Monastery, where I was a nun for 15 years, and disrobed in my, as I turned 40, and have been reconstructing a life now as a lay practitioner and teacher and mentor and writer. And yeah, I have 2 books. I don't know, should I say?
Yes, please.
The books. Okay. The first one I wrote is We Were Made for These Times, 10 Lessons in Moving Through Change, Loss, and Disruption. And it's also an audio course. And then the one that's just come out with 2 dear friends is Healing Our Way Home, Black Buddhist Teachings on Ancestors' Joy and Liberation.
Thank you for that introduction. We're going to have so much to talk about. And, I think today we'll be focusing a lot on Healing Our Way Home, that second book that you spoke about. Yes. But before we get into some deeper topics around that, would you please help us set the stage with maybe a basic understanding of Buddhism, its history, its beliefs, its practices?
Sure. So the Buddha was a prince in India some 2,600 years ago, and he was called Siddhartha Gautama, and really saw that there were things he was not being clearly taught or shown in his very protected palace life, and he was determined to really find the key to unlocking this, prison of suffering that even though he was a prince, he realized he was caught in greed, in anger, in selfishness, in delusion, and he decided to go live as an ascetic. For 6 years, he meditated in the forest, cut off his long, all the signs of his royalty. He released them and wore a very simple monastic ascetic clothing and meditated, found the way, what we call the middle way, of really realizing like 4 noble truths: that there is suffering in this world. We all are served a dose of dissatisfaction, of difficulty, but it's possible to understand the second noble truth, that where this suffering comes from, why it comes about. Thirdly, that there is a path to end that suffering, or that, happiness is possible. And then fourthly, that there is this eightfold noble path that leads to happiness, that leads to the ending of suffering. And that's what he taught about for the rest of his days, for another 50 years or so. That basic path of seeing that suffering exists and that it can be understood and that it can be healed and that another path can be taken of real well-being has been practiced in, various traditions. There's the early Buddhism of Theravada that continued with the Buddha's teachings. And then there was the Mahayana, where Zen, Pure Land, many traditions come in. And then there's the Tibetan Vajrayana school. So there's 3 schools, main schools, many variations within each one of those. But they all have the same understanding of these 4 noble truths and how to live an ethical, a life deeply grounded in awareness of really paying attention to the way things are so that we can be in harmony with that and develop the deepest potential of each of us, that each one of us can become a Buddha, can become awakened. And so we practice to unearth that which is already in us.
Thank you so much for taking the time to level set for everyone listening. Misasha, I don't know about you, but I've had sort of this baseline level of understanding just because of my Japanese branch of my family. And, Namu Amida Butsu and like the Japanese ancestral honor, like there's some that has just come through my own life. But, knowing how long the Buddhist tradition is, but knowing how constant it is to our daily life, I'm personally in a little bit of awe that you had the opportunity and blessing to know Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh. Like, I've had one of his books in my home for the kids since they were little. Could you share a little bit about knowing him?
Sure. It was one of the biggest blessings of my life. I think it will be for the rest of my life. As soon as I saw him for the first time, I knew he was my teacher. There was this immediate moment of recognition. He has this deep, he's passed away, but in his presence, you would feel this deep calm and stability, very real strength, but also a lightness and a joy. And many people have described feeling that when he looked at them, they felt a very deep love, kind of acceptance they had never experienced before. So he had this capacity to pervade a room with calm, with well-being, because of how deeply rooted he was. And just, every moment with his walking, each step, he would be very present. So if I was, attending him, as we would do as monastics, as novices, we each had a chance to be his attendant. And you would see, people walking with him. And if they would start to talk, he would stop because he didn't want to walk and talk at the same time. He wanted to just walk when he was walking, to give all of his attention to his steps. And that's what he taught also, that we should really be very with our steps, because you can touch a great freedom in your steps if you're there for your life, So he really practiced what he preached, walked his talk, but not at the same time. And he was a spiritual father, to many of us, a real guide, a real balm of compassion. And, he could also tell you off if you were out of line. It was not with anger, but with just a real direct, this was wrong. You need to work on this, or however he would say it. But he had this amazing capacity for both gentleness and strength. And he could be very fierce also when he was telling certain governments that they needed to, shift how they were doing things. Or, he could be very tender. He could talk about crying when the U.S. invaded Iraq, waking, with his face full of tears. So he had this heart that was just big enough for everyone.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts for those of us who never had a chance to be in his presence. I want to shift gears for a second. And in your, self-introduction, you mentioned that you were biracial. Mm-hmm. And that's something that, Sarah and I, especially recently, have talked a lot about. And I think what makes biracial or multiracial people somewhat special is that you're used to floating, therefore, in many different worlds and sort of grappling with the larger question of what it means to belong
Mm-hmm.
and in which spaces you do belong. And so, given that, what would you like listeners to understand about what the Buddhist community is like, and in particular, why it was important to discuss and focus on Black Buddhist teachings in this book?
Well, that's a big question because there are many different Buddhist communities, and the Plum Village community of monastics is largely Vietnamese. And those of us who were non-Vietnamese, who were Westerners, would, I tried to learn some Vietnamese. I didn't become fluent, but it was a very, Asian context where we had mostly Vietnamese food. We were often listening to Thai's talks in translation, or in meetings, we would be having someone translate for us from Vietnamese to English or French or whatever language. So that was a big part of that monastic experience. And as far as the larger Plum Village lay community, or the Vipassana lay community that I'm a part of, that's mostly Americans, mostly white, although there are growing numbers of BIPOC practitioners. I would also say largely middle class, although there are efforts to really make the practices, the communities, the retreats accessible to those of all backgrounds, economically, socioeconomically, ages. But it's many things. I think, the Plum Village tradition has also emphasized a lot family practice. And so there's always children in the big retreats because we have children's programs, teens programs, young adults programs. There's a whole young adults arm of Plum Village, which is a wake-up movement where they, young people come together, practice, have retreats for themselves, and it's a very vibrant community. So similar things are there in the Vipassana community as well, as far as retreats. So it's, I would say, a dynamic community of many groups and people that are trying to really emphasize diversity. I know that's the case in both of these traditions that I've been trained in, that where there's greater awakening as to what prevents people from taking part, and trying to reduce those obstacles so people can access these teachings.
Thank you for sharing that, and in particular about the different types of communities. And I want to ask a little bit more about Black Buddhist teachings, because I think that is something that I know in my very rudimentary knowledge of Buddhism, as Sarah pointed out, mostly related to ancestral and familial ties, that has never come up. So I'm super curious to hear more, as I know this has been a focus for this book.
Yeah. So maybe I can just share a little bit how the book came about and answer the question that way. So Valerie Brown, who was a, high-powered lawyer, lobbyist on Capitol Hill, and Maricela Gomez. Valerie Brown's heritage is from Jamaica, though she grew up in Brooklyn. And Maricela Gomez is a medical doctor and activist who worked a lot on housing justice in East Baltimore. And both of them are Dharma teachers, as am I, in the Plum Village tradition. And so Valerie Brown approached both of us at a mindfulness and education conference that we were all attending in DC, and said, we really should write a book about our Black experience in our spiritual tradition. And we were all excited about it. And so we started to meet over Zoom. This sort of happened starting 2019. And all through the pandemic, we would meet and record our conversations. And then those got transcribed. And basically each conversation got put into a chapter. Made into a chapter. But we really wanted to dig in and explore for ourselves what our own ancestral journeys had been, what our understandings of race and liberation, how that informs our practice as Buddhist teachers and practitioners. And we really wanted to make this path more accessible and available to people who had experiences like ours, where they may not see people that looked like them on the Dharma seat or writing the books about this, how to practice or what practice is. So we wanted to add that voice of with our particular perspective.
I so appreciate that you did that. And along those lines of practice, I was wondering if I could ask this question so that maybe people can listen to this conversation and start some of the inquiry, because we'll be releasing this episode when closer to the summer, when people have more time to really reflect and think. And I know the book is structured in a way that takes us through this path of discovery. Like you mentioned, reflecting on our ancestors, relationships with ourselves, contextualizing racial and social justice. So what are some of the questions you think we should all and could all be asking of ourselves?
Yeah, I think this teaching of coming home to ourselves, we could ask ourselves, what does it mean for me to really come home to myself, to really be with myself, to be deeply present and listening to myself with all of the things that are here, with the voices that I don't always want to listen to, or the parts of me that are needing attention that I'm not giving my attention to. So I think that's a big part of what each of us share in our book, is how we are learning and practicing to come home to ourselves, to really be there for ourselves, because that's the foundation of really being able to be there for others and be present for all the chaos in our world. And if we don't have good doorways back to that feeling of being stable, of being settled inside, it's going to be very hard for us as more and more things begin to break down. We're in this time of polycrisis, where many structures are breaking down. And so having the ability to have a place of refuge that we really are cultivating. We need to cultivate that when times are sort of good or neutral, so that when times get really chaotic, we have that, So that's one question I think we should be asking ourselves, is what am I doing to strengthen that island inside of myself that can really provide refuge for me? And then also, I think one of the questions this book really invites people to look at is, what has shaped me? Who are my ancestors? What are the messages that I have received from them? What are the skills? What is the suffering? What is the trauma that I continue from my ancestors? And how can I be about being free, right? Not just for myself, but also for all my ancestors. Because when we get free, when we touch freedom, that's all of our ancestors in us are also able to touch freedom. So, an invitation to really meditate on our the upstream, to look upstream and to see really what's impacted us, what's brought us to this moment, not just individually, but collectively, because that's also a big part, I think, of the healing that we need to do as a culture, as a society, is to really honor what brought us here. I appreciate that you said you're an amateur historian, Mishasha, because we live in an anti-historical moment that wants to bury everything or ignore, reality. So honoring, understanding that. And then lastly, I would say a very important question is, what is my purpose here? What do I have to bring? How can I really show up with the gifts that I have in this moment? Because this is a time of great need where we all need to show up with all of our gifts and all of our wisdom.
Thank you. Those sound like three simple questions, yet are incredibly deep and thoughtful, and, involve I see it as sort of peeling back layers, right? And the more layers you peel back, the more powerful it becomes, right? Because of that self-exploration. And, you mentioned that we are in a time of polycrises, right? Which I think is a beautiful way of saying what Sarah and I say every 2 weeks on this podcast. And so I want to ask you a little bit about that, because I also love that the concept for this book came from, the three of you first talking about this at a mindfulness seminar, because I think sometimes people see mindfulness on one side and, fighting injustice on the other, right? So how do you position sort of the idea of mindfulness and these tenets of Buddhism and being present and thinking about the upstream with the need to also, resist or fight really systemic injustice?
Well, I feel very fortunate that, our teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, really coined the term engaged Buddhism, which was all about bringing those two streams together. That if you really are practicing and looking deeply at what's happening in the world, you can't but act. You can't but involve yourself, engage yourself. Because if you see suffering, you see injustice, you sitting there in a meditation hall on your meditation cushion alone is not going to cut it. And so, his life really exemplified this in terms of often putting his life at risk to bring supplies to people during the war in Vietnam who, were cut off from food or medicine, and then calling for peace, which made him very unpopular, both with the North, with the communists, and then South, U.S.-backed forces. And so his life was threatened by both sides, and eventually he had to, live in exile. It wasn't safe for him to return to the country. So then he continued to do humanitarian work to support refugees and orphans in Vietnam, and that work goes on to this day. Working with children and others impacted by Agent Orange, and in many other countries too, projects to support the poor and young people and children. So I think the thing that Thai really articulated was when he was doing all this work, he started the School of Youth for Social Service, where there were thousands of young people studying and then going out into the villages during the war to support, schools and agriculture and development. And every week they took one day of mindfulness, one day to come back and practice, to meditate, to walk in awareness, to eat a meal slowly and mindfully, to have, the chance to sing and to share stories and to share their insights. And so even in such an urgent time where people were, dying under the bombs, he knew if you don't have this respite on a regular basis, you can't continue the work because it's so taxing, and you need to have this way to refresh yourself. So I'll just tell a story about this too. When I was a nun, we were on a U.S. tour with Thai. We call Thich Nhat Hanh Thai. It means teacher in Vietnamese. And we were on the bus from South California going up to Northern California. And it was September 11th, 2001. And we heard on our Walkmans what was happening. And we're so shocked, And all of us who are from the U.S. were starting to talk on the bus, make a plan how we could come out with a press release the next day, that we would go to our publishing house in Berkeley once we got up to Northern California and bring together the documents to make a press release. So we came to Thai that night once we arrived at the monastery we were staying at. And we said, this is what we want to do to help, make a response. And Thai said, no, we're not going to do that. You aren't going to do that. He's like, I don't want you to do that. Tomorrow we're going to go to the beach. And we were not expecting that as a response. We were filled with urgency and kind of worry. And yet we all went to the beach. We swam, I saw dolphins. We had a picnic lunch. We played games on the beach. We nourished ourselves. We nourished each other. And then the next day we did all of those things. We did everything we had planned to do. We just first stopped and really took care, this coming home to ourselves. And then our action had a lot more groundedness in it because we had had that day of taking care first. So that was a very powerful lesson. So I think for me, that's like a story that kind of embodies how those two things of, justice, activism, and deep spiritual practice can come together.
Misasha, are you laughing? Because that sounds like exactly the advice I need when I'm in my frantic mode and I want to get it all done and get it done like yesterday. And this idea of nourishing yourself first is something we can all speak about, but to actively do it, to have a practice that regularly enforces that sounds incredibly powerful and incredibly good for us as humans, as spirits, as people. I mean, in all of those ways. So I really appreciate you sharing that.
Thank you.
I do too, because I think the advice I always get from people who are close to me when I tend to kick into that sort of frantic mode is to slow down, right? Slow down. And I think that that is such a hard concept for us in the West a lot to really internalize, especially as everything seems to be pushing us to speed up, to act faster. But the power in the respite, right? The power in the coming home is one that I think your story illustrated so beautifully. So thank you. You know, I feel like you have been teaching both of us throughout this conversation, but you also teach Buddhist mindfulness and meditation all over the globe.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm super curious, especially given that last story, what have you noticed as being the largest difference in approach to these studies between students in the United States and those who live abroad?
I really don't know that there's that much of a difference, honestly. I think one of the things I'll often recall is when, I lived in France for 5 years. I lived in Germany for 5 years as a nun. Every time I would come back to the US, coming back into the country, I could feel the fear. I could feel, oh, this is a country at war. So just that at that level, very nationally of sort of, collective consciousness, there was this sense of we are not a country at ease with itself. But as it relates to actual, working with people in different countries and different, languages, cultures, this everyone, everywhere, there are the same, the same issues, the same kinds of suffering, the same confusion, the same, getting caught up in our sense of a separate self. So, yeah, I think it's, maybe in the US it goes faster, the pace is faster. So there's a little more, it's like you were saying, Sarah, it's a little harder to slow things down because it's not just in us, that going miles a minute, it's all around us. And I think that's a little bit more pronounced in the US where things are open 24 hours a day. I mean, a lot of German towns, things close on Sundays. You just can't, you can't go shopping, or just it's a certain, well, for sure that happens here too. But there's this more emphasis on like everything all the time, anytime, anywhere, meet your needs. So I think, yeah, maybe there's more frenetic energy, but the people who find their way to retreats or to meditation groups, there's probably quite a lot in common across cultures of people who are seeking.
I agree that fear. I mean, I say this to Misasha. My husband is Canadian, and there's a sense of safety. There's I would happily, and I have fallen asleep in a public setting in Canada by my relatives' places, and there is not a chance that I would feel safe enough just crossing the border and coming down here. And I can't explain it. It sounds ridiculous, but yet I know that to be true in my body. And so I appreciate hearing that. What is, to circle this conversation back to where we started with the book you've co-written, what do you think is the most important thing that the three of you would like readers to take away from Healing Your Way Home?
Well, I think that the question you asked, Misasha, about the bringing together of these justice and sort of inner healing, I think that's really one piece that we'd really like people to take away from this book, is that you can heal yourself, you can come home to yourself, and that is very much a part of and what facilitates supporting the collective to heal from racism, from the historical legacies of oppression and violence and injustice, from patriarchy, from all the isms, all the othering ways that we have. So I think there's a lot on caring for ourselves and also how we can take action, how we can show up in situations of injustice, of harm, without hatred, without us and them. So I think that's one thing. I think we really want this book to open the doors to those who may not see themselves represented in the Dharma world or on the teaching seats. So I think that's one of the wishes as well. And I think just, this importance of having a spiritual dimension in all that we do, in all the, current day divisions, the polarization. This book really was an experience of interbeing, of interconnectedness, not of individualism. Like we are very much individuals and we really tell our own unique stories, but that couldn't have happened without each other. Like this image of a stool with 3 legs. If you take one leg away, the others collapse. And it was like that with the 3 of us, that one person's question evoked someone else's insight, and that insight then evoked a story I never would have told otherwise. I never even maybe would have remembered. And so there was this, a kind of call and response and an improvisation, and this like very jazzy, rhythmic, like, oh yeah, what you're saying. And that's bringing this up in me, very improvised. So I think it was such an experience of spiritual friendship and how that can really guide us. Just like a teacher is a guide, but spiritual friends are a guide. We say Sangha is one of the 3 gems. There's the Buddha, there's the Dharma, there's the Sangha, spiritual community. It's one of our teachers. It's one of our ways that we stay on this path. So this, I think the book really, through its very way that it came about, through its very structure, let alone the words in the book, it exemplifies interbeing and interdependence and the importance of spiritual friendship, that we actually can't reach where we want to go in terms of awakening or deep freedom on our own. It's only in community with others. And we can't do that for our collective, except, as a collective. So the honesty, the atmosphere of acceptance, of deep listening, of support, how we were so curious and interested in each other and affirming. I think all of that is it exemplifies what a spiritual practice can facilitate for us individually, but also in a collective.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. Is there anything else that you feel like our listeners need to know before we end the recording?
I would love to just share. I didn't touch on this, I don't think, but I did mention that I got married right at the beginning as part of my coming back to lay life. My husband is an Episcopal priest, and we guide a monthly group that's Buddhist and Christian, Christian meditation and action. But we're also starting a center in upstate New York, and would just love for people to know about that. We'll be wanting people to come and practice this weaving of various spiritualities. Many young people now are spiritual but not religious, so we want to also offer teachings and practices that can support people wherever they are on their spiritual path.
How will people find more information about the new center?
It's not on my website yet, but it will be soon. But KairaJewel.com, and then we'll have our own website hopefully soon as well about the center.
That's a really wonderful idea, because as you say, it will serve such a wonderfully growing population of folks that could still use this level of spiritual community and connection. And I'm excited to learn more about that.
Yeah, excited to stay in touch with you about it.
You've just listened to the Dear White Women podcast with your hosts, Sarah and me, Sasha. Yes, we're on social media. And yes, you can hire us to do talks about our book. But the biggest thing, don't forget to sign up for our newsletter to receive our free materials. Head over to dearwhitewomen.com to get on the list.